Tonight on Insights on PBS Hawaii. The search process is underway for a new University of Hawaii president. What qualities should be considered when selecting the university's top executive? Now, live in our studio, our host, Malia Mattoch.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. Last month's announcement of UH President MRC Greenwood's September retirement has launched a Board of Regents Presidential Selection Committee to recruit the university's next president. That new president, the university's 15th, will be responsible for overseeing one of the state's largest institutions with 10 campuses and more than 60,000 students. Tonight, we have gathered some of the university's primary stakeholders. We're joined by leaders from both the faculty and student body, as well as the chair of the Presidential Search Committee, to share ideas and concerns about the presidential selection process. What is the best criteria to determine if a candidate will be an effective leader? What role should the future president play in promoting academic success and financial health? What initiatives should the new executive advance to further our state's economic growth, create jobs, and encourage community partnerships? You can join our conversation by calling, emailing, or tweeting your questions and comments. The contact information you now see on your screen will be repeated throughout the program. Insights is also streaming live on your computer and will be posted on our website after the broadcast. The live stream is closed caption, just like our broadcast. And now, on to our panel. Regent John Holzman is the chair of the University of Hawaii's Board of Regents Presidential Selection Committee. The Board of Regents is the 15-member governing body of the University of Hawaii system. John is a retired diplomat with extensive experience in the Asia-Pacific and Middle East regions. David Duffy is the board president of the University of Hawaii's Professional Assembly, the sole bargaining agent for nearly 4,000 faculty members in the UH system. He is also a professor of botany at the UH Manoa campus. Richard Mizusawa is serving a second term as the president of the Associated Students of the University of Hawaii. ASUH's membership represents over 14,000 full-time classified undergraduates at the UH Manoa campus. Richard is pursuing a degree in communication and speech communicology and a minor in business administration. Busy. Tom Robinson is the president of the University of Hawaii's Graduate Student Organization, which represents the academic interest of over 5,000 graduate students attending UH Manoa. GSO representatives sit on over 40 university committees and participate in a variety of campus and community events. Tom is pursuing his doctorate degree in meteorology. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. This is, of course, important topic for so many people in the state. It affects so many, and all eyes are on the university right now in terms of this search. John, can you give us a sense of the timeline involved in finding this interim president and the permanent president?
Sure, I'd be glad to do that. President Greenwood's last day will be August 31st, and so we need to have an interim president in the seat on September 1. The reason we need that is because it's really just like President Truman once said, the buck stops here. We need someone in that chair, so that's where the buck will stop and accountability will be clear. Someone will be in charge and keep the wheels rolling and keep the teachers teaching, the researchers researching, and the students learning. Right. So that's the first priority we have. And we're carrying out that search right now, and we hope to have someone identified soon. Certainly before President Greenwood leaves. Okay. In the meantime, we'll also have the search committee, of which I'm the chair, and we're getting organized now. We're trying to make some of the decisions that you mentioned, or beginning to approach the decisions that you mentioned about do we want a search firm? And if so, from where? What kind of a search do we want to conduct?
So that has not been decided, whether there will be a search firm?
That has not been decided. I would say that there's a lot to be said for a search firm, since people don't look for presidents that often. Most of us have never looked for a president, and so we're going to need some good advice. But what the final decision will be, I can't say just yet. We also have to think about how do we include others in this process, and that's going to be very, very important, because we're going to want the views of the faculty, of the students, of the alumni, I mean, there's just many stakeholders in the university. And lastly, how do we reach out to the wider community of Hawaii to get their views and hear their voices, because that's going to be very important too.
Yeah. Quick question before we turn it over to the others. Do you guys have a salary range?
Do we have a salary range? We were just talking about that beforehand. We do not. I can say that the present salary that President Greenwood earns is probably somewhere about the average for presidents of university systems at the size of UH. On the other hand, her salary is a lot less if we were looking at a big private company that had $1.5 billion running through it and the number of employees you mentioned and 60,000 people that it was serving every day. On the other hand, her salary is twice or three times the size of the governor's.
Right.
So there's a big range there, and it's going to depend on who the final candidate is, and it'll be a negotiation.
Okay.
But we are certainly aware that people are concerned about high salaries at the university,
Right.
and that is a factor in our mind.
Has gotten a lot of attention. To put in perspective how challenging this sort of search and selection can be, David, you wrote in your testimony, we've had 3 presidents in the last 10 years with only 1 serving their full contract. You said we cycled through presidents faster than we graduate students in our 4-year institutions. Why do you think that's happening?
Maybe we should appoint all our students as president and rotate. It's a rough job. And I think people, well, there's 2 things. One, the present system was set up in, I guess, 2001 when Dobell brought it in, and it's resulted in lots of new chancellors, vice chancellors, and so the system has become much more complex than it was 10, 15 years ago. The other thing is that, just talking to a few people, being a system president is not much fun. The chancellor is the one who's got the students, they've got the football team, they've got the buildings, they can get out and do things. What does a president do? If they're good, they make the trains run on time. Or you can start a new campus if you're in California, or you could. But there's not much to do except facilitate others. And so it takes a very special type of person. And here also, I think, and I'll shut up, we don't know what we want out of the university. And in a way, the position should help us define that. But until we've had that conversation, we're going to probably spit out presidents.
Interesting. I see some head nodding from our student representatives. Richard and Tom, any thoughts on that topic? In terms of trying to find the right fit, what is the temperature among students right now? What is the discussion in terms of what they're hoping for?
I would say that we're hoping for more transparency and more openness from the system level offices in general and from the president. A lot of times we feel like what we want is kind of ignored at that level. You know, when the tuition increase came down, there was a lot of voice against it, and it was kind of just ignored, it felt like. And we've the system level has also had invoked a new graduate employment policy, and we strongly disagreed with it, and they just keep going on with it despite, you know, all of our concerns and stuff. So I think we're looking for someone who's a little more open to the student input and the student voice.
Okay, that brings up, in terms of this process of selection, the meetings thus far have been closed-doored. Is that correct?
No.
Okay. Tell me about that.
Well, at the last meeting we had, which was just on a week ago today, that was open. All our regents were there. We went around the room. All of them expressed views on the type of person they would like to see as the next president of the university. And I can touch on that, but I'd also like to go back to David's point about the system. But first, what I think they were saying was the next president, they want to be committed to education, higher education in Hawaii, to have faith in the faculty and the students that they can achieve excellence here in Hawaii, that we will be building the educational capital of this state for the future, and we understand that. And a person who is here not because this is part of a career, not because of the salary, not because of the prestige, but they're here because of their commitment to higher education here. And that's what we're looking for, plus the management and the leadership.
Right. Richard, you were saying earlier that a lot of students on campus are saying perhaps this should be someone from Hawaii. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so when we heard about President Greenwood's retirement in September, it sparked a lot of conversations not only within my Senate, but it also sparked conversations between friends and constituency, and a lot of them expressed views of possibly having the interim president and even the permanent president be someone from in-house, someone from the University of Hawaii system or from one of the 10 institutions we have here in Hawaii. And I think that'd be a really good thing to look into, because I think we should also, kind of how you're mentioning, we should have faith in the faculty, faith in those that work here, that they can help lead this institution, they can help lead higher education and put it on the map, you know, in terms of having it be nationally ranked, having a presence here in Hawaii, and having that confidence that the UH system is a place where local students and international and national students can get their higher education. You know, it's not a place people should be afraid of, it's somewhere people should want to go and be proud to be.
Do you think that students feel like they've had enough access sort of to what has gone on so far in terms of the selection process? Are they wanting more?
I mean, so this year for the GSO, I've actually appointed someone who, when this committee gets formed, hopefully he will serve on it. So hopefully, you know, it's still early, so hopefully the student opinions will increase as it goes on later.
Getting back to the interim or permanent president being from Hawaii, how many of you at this table feel that one or the other absolutely should be from Hawaii?
I think the interim should definitely be someone from Hawaii, someone local. Just again, I was touching on the point that someone local would be able to touch on the culture and have that understanding, be able to connect with the people here. And as in their term as interim, you know, and at least it's only for that short period of time where they can help try to move forward things while we search for the permanent president. And for me, I think the next permanent president, whether they're local or someone national or international, I think that's fine with me, and as long as they can help achieve the missions of the UH system.
Do you think that amongst the regents there is a feeling that perhaps this interim should be local?
I'm not sure what you mean by local. I mean, what does it mean to be
have
from
a Hawaii connection?
Sure,
Yeah,
Hawaii,
that's true.
Hawaii connection.
Right.
My family's been in Hawaii for a while, a long while. I went to school here, and then I went away, and now I've come back. And there's lots of people like that. So I'm not sure what it means to be from Hawaii, because is Norm Chow from Hawaii right now? He went away, and now he's come back. So I think we have to be say, what's the connection to Hawaii? How does that person, how will he fit in? How will he work here?
Right.
Yeah, we recognize that's an important factor. But if you look at the equation of variables that go into the next president, that will be one, and it'll be an important one, but it's not the only one.
Sure, absolutely.
And it's not going to be a litmus test.
For it.
No, that would be unwise.
What about in terms of, some people seem to feel that perhaps it needs to be someone from outside the UH community so that they can come in and make some changes. I've heard that said by people. Any thoughts on that?
For the permanent or for the interim?
For the interim.
Yeah, that's been one point of view, and but what are you going to change to?
Right.
And again, it's going to be sort of random if they just come in and rearrange the furniture. So again, it gets back to that conversation of where we want to go and how we want to organize things.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to see someone who's not necessarily an administrator kind of take on that role, who is from Hawaii, you know, because then they could have that sense of they're here, they know the connections already, but they have different ideas than what's already being expressed in the system offices right now.
Right, that makes sense.
I think I would add, sort of in line with what David's saying, is that if we're going to have someone come in to sort of make changes and clean house, usually on campuses and universities, they have this idea of shared governance. And changes like that, especially fundamental changes, are changes that come through a lot of dialogue over a period of time, and everyone is confident that it makes sense. And so to ask an interim to come in and make structural changes, for example, it is probably not going to happen.
Right, even though people talk about it, in reality, talking about it is different from what could actually
I would
work.
think so,
right.
especially given the tradition of this shared governance.
Let's talk about the president who is leaving. Where did she succeed? Where did President Greenwood succeed, in your opinion? What attributes of hers would you like to see carried forward in the next president?
I think she did a good job of just managing the whole system in general, and like keeping track of the accomplishments of each campus. And if you go to the Board of Regents meetings and hear her do her president report, she's very informed on what's going on campus, and she knows the stuff that students are doing that's important. And I think she did a really good job with that.
I agree with Tom. I think she's very knowledgeable on throughout what the UH system is doing. I would always go on to the Hawaii system website, and she would have her blogs, she would have her reports up to date, and it would just be so interesting and it has a good feeling to show that the president knows exactly what's going on to the specific details of, a campus being built and whatnot. I think she also helped move forward a lot of projects and initiatives throughout her tenure here at UH system. So for example, the Cancer Center, the progression of the UH West Oahu campus. I'm sure that she's helped progress that and has made sure that was done in a timely manner. I know that the West Oahu campus was done completely under budget, I believe, as well. So those kind of accomplishments, it's the little things that she's done that have really helped the University of Hawaii system move forward.
It sounds like you guys will be sad to see her go. Would you say, or are you ready for a new leader?
I think change is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think especially with her reasonings for stepping down and retiring, I think there are legitimate reasons for a family to take care of her health. I think it's I think again, change is sometimes it's a good thing, and it's having someone new is a good start for moving again forward.
And moving forward.
Yeah.
People don't go to see the president or a dean or a chancellor because they're feeling good. They've got a problem. You're supposed to solve it. In her case, I don't want to blame the Regents, but in a way, she got lured into athletics, and NCAA rules say that the chancellor basically is in charge of that. And I'm not saying the Regents, but there was sort of let's do something about this. And we have an outgoing chancellor, we have an incoming one, let's do something in the meantime. And so she got into a area that the appointment of the football coach, other things. And then we had the Wonder thing. And that was really something that was unfortunate. And I think looking in years down, we're going to forget that. It was, hate to say it, but in business, if you lose $200,000, if you ventured that and you lose it, it's not a big thing.
Right.
But
this took a huge toll.
Yeah.
On the university.
And it distracted her, and it distracted everybody.
Right. Right. All right, let's take some questions from viewers. The first question, is there any way to get around the escalating salary rates for university presidents, which speaks to what you said earlier, and is it just the way it goes?
It's the problem we basically have is that the University of Hawaii doesn't make the market for presidents, and we want to get a good president with a lot of different qualities. And if we get lucky, yes, maybe we'll get one who's less expensive than others, and we hope that's the case. But we can't expect Hawaii to sort of take the lead in changing the pay scale for executive management. Having said that, we understand the problem, and we are going, and it really is on our mind, and we really do want to be mindful of it when we do this search.
The next one is a comment which kind of speaks to what we just spoke of in terms of Hawaii. This viewer says, save money and find a UH president who doesn't need to learn about Hawaii and its people, a local resident who will know more than anyone chosen from the mainland. A Hawaiian president might be better if UH wants to become the best indigenous serving institution in the Pacific and the world. Any response to that? We just did touch on Hawaii, and I know you were saying it's very hard to sort of say what is a connection to Hawaii.
It's hard to say what is a connection to Hawaii, because there are many people who are connected in different ways. But what that person just described would be great if we could find those qualities and other qualities all put together in the same person.
So they need to contact you. That person needs to, the person described needs to contact you.
I think that limiting it to just someone who's in Hawaii is not necessarily going to be good for business, because you want to get the best person in there that can do all of those things. And if that person isn't from Hawaii, then they should be in that position, not just, just because they're from Hawaii, then they should be in that position.
And it's interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember during the last election process there being so much talk about someone from Hawaii. Perhaps there was. I'm wondering if it gets back to your point of 3 presidents in 10 years, is something not working if we're not able to see through these terms? And maybe what's not working is it needs to be someone with, I don't know, perhaps that's...
Well, we don't know. This has been one of the things that's come up, that maybe if you arrive knowing the system,
you're going to do okay.
But
right?
I'd speak in some ways that, yes, that's true, but if you become the chancellor of the Florida system, you're going to have a lot of stuff to learn off the bat, or Chicago. All politics are local,
right.
And so in a way, I don't think we're worse than,
right.
we're better than anyone else.
I would like to add to that. When we looked for the president for President Greenwood, that search, there was a sense at the time that we wanted to take the university to a new level, and that was really important to us. And we wanted someone with a national reputation as an outstanding academic, and she is all those things.
Right.
And she has taken this university to a new level in terms of our graduation initiative, in terms of research, in terms of support, monetary support for research. And there's a host of projects out there. Now, what we seem to be hearing is people are looking for not just that, but they're looking for management, leadership, consolidation, transparency, accountability, really sort of budget,
and legislature. I also hear a lot of discussion of that. Right.
Sort of pocketbook issues in how you manage and run a university. And I'm not saying that President Greenwood did not do a good job in that, but I think there's more of an emphasis on that than there is on the academic side. So we're in a different place,
right.
And so we want a different president.
Right.
That's good. Change.
Right. Change.
Yes.
All right. Here's a question from Cookie and Kahala. How can the UH and the future presidents cultivate strong relationships with the local business community? Any thoughts on that one? Anyone want to take that one?
Having lunch with everybody who invite you. I shouldn't say this, but one former president told me he'd lost a lot of weight because he didn't have to go to so many receptions after he left office. And just sort of like a politician, just getting out there, having a simple message that you repeat to as many people, stop them in the street, shake their hands, kiss the babies, and convince them that UH is good value.
And that seemed to be, it did seem to me that this current and departing president had strong relationships with the business community. Is very, very well respected. And maybe this is a good time to talk about the Hawaii Innovation Initiative and some of the other programs that have been going on. Is that going to be a priority for the next president to continue some of these programs?
I think first off, the idea that the graduation initiative and trying to get as many of our children through higher education is going to be a primary objective, and reaching out to areas in the state that are underserved. That will continue, absolutely. We just couldn't do without that. The innovation initiative and having the UH serve as sort of a second engine of growth and help the economy diversify, especially through the innovation initiative, yes, that will be
important. And that was well liked in the business community.
I think it was. I think it was, and it's really something that we're just developing now.
Right. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there was an American general who once said, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. And so a lot of the concern about that is simply the logistics. The university is going to increase in 5 or 10 years, increase its research by $500 million. And of course, this was started before recent events, but we have trouble, as a PI, principal investigator, I have trouble spending the money I raise. It's often very difficult. And this has been true for a decade or before. We don't have the physical space. We're renovating buildings, but to have that rapid an increase, you need space, and you need grad students, so you need more resources for them. And so there's this logistic core that needs to be met. And of course, if you don't have a big vision, you're not going to move toward it. But I think what's been talked about is unrealistic. In the long run, I think the more students we graduate with the higher degree, the better. That's what's going to get us there eventually. It won't be as fast as people want. One of the things that I've heard from one of the deans is that our high school students often leave the state. A student who gets a graduate degree here is probably about 80% of them are staying.
All right. What about sort of the issue after you have all referenced the Stevie Wonder issue that has been in the press? I'm wondering how important is transparency after this whole ordeal in a way that the university has been through? Is that an increasingly important attribute?
I think with that whole debacle, I think that the most important thing for me would be kind of defining the role of the president more so, and having transparency included in that, because it was kind of handled in a way that, like, it should have been on the chancellor and the athletics director, and that was it, and it got way out of hand. It completely escalated because the president got involved. So I think that yes, redefining that role and putting transparency and all of this other stuff into there is very important.
Anyone else on that?
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
There's transparency and there's accountability, and I think the two got confused. UH has more accountability than any place I've been, although some people in the federal government might argue. It's, as I said, it's hard to spend money, and we pre-audit, we don't post-audit, so everything is checked to make sure it'll pass an audit. And so we have the checks and balances in place. In this case, there was a gap, something happened, and it went right through the gap and scored a touchdown. But we don't need that sort of accountability. We need to facilitate systems to make them work better.
Okay.
I would add that we need more transparency and we need more accountability. The Stevie Wonder fiasco is an interesting case in point, because to this very day, no one has accepted responsibility for that. So why is that so? We have since put in place a new athletics policy, which very clearly establishes both transparency and accountability, going from the president, from the board, to the president, to the chancellor, where it rests on his shoulders, and then to the athletic director. And we expect that to be...
So hopefully it's on its way.
And that should be applied
Right.
overall throughout the university, and I think that will be one of the emphases of the board in the future.
Right. Let's go to some other questions. Dave in Mo'iliili, why is the word charisma never mentioned in the conversation about a UH president? Interesting question.
Yeah, so this is another point, is like, my friend, he's from Ohio State, and their president has been under huge scrutiny recently, and he said that this guy survives because he comes to the dining hall and he sits with the students, he'll sit with you and he'll say, what's going on campus, what are your issues? And that's the kind of charisma that has let him survive there.
He makes a connection.
Yeah, he makes a connection. So I think that's interesting. That's a really good question, because it is something that will help, I think, a president in that position, to stay there.
Is that charisma, or that's just being humble and being with people and relating to them? I'm just...
so when he's making his outrageous comments, everyone's, it's like, you think it's kind of funny, even though it's horrible, but it's like he says it jokingly.
People are drawn to him.
Yeah, he says it jokingly and he gets away with it. Yeah. And so that kind of thing has helped him to survive in that position,
One reason we probably don't use the charisma word is because of Dobell, who was great on charisma, and so.
Okay, Richard, you looked like you had a thought on that.
Yes,
charisma and UH president.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to what Tom said. I think we need someone. I mean, especially for the students, they want to see who their leader is, who's serving them within their institution. I know that recently Chancellor Apple, when he first started, he did that. He came to the dining halls. He was walking around, talking to his students. And even though President Greenwood or the next UH president will be for the system, it'd be nice to see them on campus, especially here at Manoa. And even, when she goes to, or the next president goes to board meetings, does campus visits, it'd be nice for them to sit down and eat lunch with students, because that's when they're going to connect with them. That's when they're going to be able to express their views, and that next president will be able to speak more on behalf of the students, having their opinions in mind more so, because they're directly relating with them. And
so it sounds like that's something you're wanting the selection committee to look at, is have they had contact with students? Have they been involved in student affairs, or a teacher or a professor, or someone who's definitely got that background as a high priority in this process?
Yeah, so I submitted testimony last week to the BOR meeting on the selection process, and I just mentioned a few qualities I think the next president should have. So I mentioned experiencing work with students, so whether that be through them being a faculty member, advising students. I really think that connection with students is key, because you can't forget who you're serving, especially here at the University of Hawaii. Students have strong connections with each other, so when they feel that they have that strong presence and connection with the administration, I feel that helps them build confidence in them, that they can serve them better, and it just helps both sides overall.
All right.
And like a bottom-up model is a good model. Ideas can come from the bottom and work their way up. They don't just have to come from the top, and everybody has to do what's told to them. Yeah.
Right. This is a tweet. Does the search committee have a concrete plan to involve community and student input in the search process?
We do not have a concrete plan yet, but we have a concrete intention to do it.
Okay, so we've got your word. We've got your word. We like that. We're getting a lot of questions, so we'll start moving through
these. If that doesn't happen, I'll be at the Regents meeting.
You've heard it here. Mike from Hawai'i Kai, has there been a legislative affairs advisor for the UH? What is the cost? Will there be more emphasis going forward? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I don't believe there is, as such, a legislative advisor at the system level. And many of the campuses, have their own contacts on the legislature. In fact, that might be an issue, is are we as coordinated as we should be?
How many contacts there are.
So, no, I don't think that's the case.
Interesting. There might be too many voices, huh?
Yeah, and we're getting, in our student government, I had a meeting about this today. We're going to actually have someone that will handle legislation that's directly related to students to advise us. So there are people who do legislative advising in some way, yes.
Interesting. So after sort of the rough road of the past year, is that something that should be looked at, or is that just one more position, in terms of having a dedicated representative for the university dealing with the legislature, or should that be the president? Is that their job? That's their job.
Of the president and the chancellors. Yes.
So they need to handle that. Right. All right. How can we sell any prospect on the job as UH president? Are there too many challenges facing any new president? From Lori in IAEA. Getting back to your point of who wants the job, huh?
Yeah, well, there are always people, and maybe it's what they don't know. Maybe the outsiders are more likely. But it is a impressive institution.
In a beautiful place.
I wish people loved it more, but it's maybe sort of like teenagers with their parents, but that's sort of paternalistic. But it is a place that's worthy. It's educated our students. It's educated their parents, their grandparents. It's played a major role in the thinking about Hawaii. It's generated a lot of really good people. It's a place to be proud of.
And of course, I'm sure that this caller probably, acknowledges those points, but she's probably asking, with 3 presidents, 10 years, all of the sort of brouhaha surrounding, is the next person doomed to fail? I think that's basically what the question is, right?
I think if someone is excited enough, instead of being worried, someone who's excited and really ready to go get it, I think that would be a good challenge for someone who's up to a challenge, yeah.
If you have someone who's not afraid to fail, then otherwise it's...
I think you might add, just from the point of view of arithmetic, it's actually 2 presidents in the last 9 years.
You want to take that another year out.
I was a theoretical ecologist. We don't deal with real data.
There we go. David, actually, correct me if I'm wrong, did I read you sort of even suggest that perhaps we might want to consider eliminating the president's position, restructuring?
Well, that's part of looking at everything.
Okay.
do we need a president? We didn't have one, or we had a president, but it was combined with the Manoa chancellor. Should we go back to that? There's some people who think that that was a big mistake, and there are some people in the community colleges who think that they get ignored if you do that. And then we have all these different chancellors that are sort of like warring states that go to the regents and the ledge, or do we have the present system, or do we have, say, a president who is more like and it's a nuance from what it is now, but is more sort of staff to the regents, but the chancellors report to that person.
Okay.
They leave the chancellors alone, but review them, and if they don't work, you get rid of them. But they're not involved in the day-to-day life of campuses. They are involved in helping apportion budget with the regents, overall plans. What are these different campuses supposed to be doing?
Let me comment on that. This is really an important issue. One of the things that President Greenwood did was make a virtue out of our system. We're an island state. If you're in Kauai and you want to take calculus, you may not be able to do that because they don't offer the second year of calculus. I'm not sure but they don't offer as many courses as you do at Manoa. Same thing if you're in Lanikai, if you're in Lanai or if you're in Molokai. You may not be able to take any courses there unless you go to Maui. So how do we serve our state, and how do you make that system work for the entire state? Manoa is big, Manoa is great, it's a wonderful institution, but there's people in Maui, there's people in Kauai, there's people on the Big Island, and they're saying, we can't afford to go to Manoa.
So you're saying we
need a system, and we need a president who can make that system work for our state.
A president is not optional. Okay.
But I think because there's some overlap between the president and the campus level stuff on the system level and the campus level stuff. So I think that there should be some kind of restructuring. Now, I mean, I agree. There needs to be a president, and there needs to be someone to manage the whole system, but I think it should be just looked at in general and the role of each person.
Okay.
Take it at a practical level. If you're studying chemistry in Maui and now you want to transfer to Manoa, and you do, and they say, well, we're very sorry, most of your credits don't transfer because they don't correspond to our courses. What happens then to that person? Another year of college, perhaps? So that's one of the important things that, say, the president does, is sort of make sure that if you take a course in Maui, it will count in Manoa, or it will count in Hilo, or wherever they're going to go if they're going for a 4-year baccalaureate. These are very practical issues that really affect students.
Right.
And I know they're bureaucratically difficult, but they need to be dealt with.
Right, understandably. All right, Jackie from Kaimuki. Why does the Board of Regents need a search firm? It costs a lot of money. Now, you said you guys haven't decided, right? Is cost an issue in deciding whether to use one? Is that the issue?
It's not the issue, no. But the important issue is how do we tap all the people who might be interested in this job and qualified in all the many ways we've discussed here tonight. And 6 people or 10 people or 12 people on a search committee cannot necessarily do that. So a search firm can be a big help. And yes, they can be expensive. And one of our mandates from the board is if we do go with the search firm, how do we minimize that cost? So yes, we're aware of that.
So there are ways to minimize the cost.
Yes, there are. I mean, for example, perhaps we could use some of our own staff to do some of the administrative things that they would do.
For them.
Right.
I see.
There was a search firm for Chancellor Apple too, right?
Yes, there was.
And I would say that was highly successful. I would say that was he's a great selection for Chancellor. So I think that, if we get someone that's really good for that position, then it's worth any amount that the search firm will cost.
All right. This is an interesting tweet. Is there anything we've learned from previous recruiting that we clearly will not repeat on the next search? Is there anything we can say that did not work?
Yes.
Anyway, okay, let's hear. I want to hear everyone's take on that. That's interesting.
Well, I wasn't on the board at the time, but I think we would be perhaps a little bit more careful than we were when we hired President Obel.
Why? In what sense?
In the sense that we would look very, very carefully before we leaped.
But what, can you, What could you have seen during the selection process? What could have?
Well,
we
perhaps there should have been. Well, I wasn't there, so
Right,
I'm not going to be a Monday morning. I'm already being one to some degree, but I think you should be very, very careful in this. And if you find someone to be very impressive, fine. Let's go home and think about it. Let's ask others. Let's compare him to others or her to others, and be very, very careful, because this is really an important job.
So check and recheck those references from everyone who's been involved.
And think
with that
very
person.
carefully what you're getting and what you want.
Okay.
Be sure of that.
Anyone else on what hasn't worked?
Well, this is secondhand. It's not clear how much we actually went out and talked to people who knew him. And of course, it's Monday morning quarterbacking, but it's the story was that we didn't do as good a job as we should, and there were people who were going, "Oh my gosh," so talk to people.
Okay, this is from David from Kona. His question is there a consensus among the stakeholders on the direction they want UH to go? Any major disagreements? I suppose should UH be going more and more towards the math and sciences? What are the fields that, there's been some talk about that. Where do we want UH to go? And how does that affect the selection of the president? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure if I'm not sure if there's a clear direction and consensus among stakeholders, because you're going to have community people involved who want UH to go in one way, students who have other views, faculty, administration, and whatnot. But I think that's kind of a good thing to look at, seeing as we want this next president to define that vision and the mission of what UH should be going towards. Right, higher education is the overall goal, but right. I think where we want to go and the steps to take there is something that needs to be discussed among stakeholders, and they should be the ones to lead it, if not help define it and reach out to these stakeholders.
Right. Any other thoughts on that?
I think you want to produce students, you want to produce graduates who can put back into the economy, right? Mm-hmm. Because you benefit from going to a state school, then they can give back to the state. So I think it's important to look at what the state needs and have the university in general provide that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and what works here?
I think the only thing everybody agrees on, I hope, is that we want to use the university to make life better for the students mm-hmm. and their kids down the line. Mm-hmm. So what are the things that help with that? Kids graduating are going to be in the workforce for 50 or 60 years. I'm 60 now, and the world has changed so amazingly and unbelievably amazingly in 60 years. A lot of the fields that people went and got good money for don't exist, or
right.
They're somewhere.
So staying on top of the times.
Yeah, so what are the skills that allow you to adapt and to continue to learn? Yeah. We don't want to train people just for one narrow thing, but we also want to have them evolve. Yeah. And since we don't know the future, what are the general skills? Mm-hmm. And we also want to broaden our economy. We have to do that. Yeah. And again, there are some skills that you can teach, and we think they're more or less the right ones. There's serendipity involved, but we've got to have something that looks to the future, not just simply training people for the next 5 years.
Okay. The next question, John, this might be a good one to start with you. Is the turnover in the top UH position having a negative impact on enrollment?
On enrollment?
Enrollment is the question.
No.
No, I didn't think so, but I wanted to ask.
but we haven't. We don't know yet because we're just in the summer. But I don't think that'll be a factor.
Remember, the system doesn't have students, so it's the chancellors.
I think they're saying, my interpretation of this question is that perhaps, and that's another question for us to talk about, has press coverage been excessively negative throughout this time period? Is it affecting enrollment? Is it affecting the perception of UH? I think that's what perhaps this person is asking. Any
Are you
thoughts?
asking me again?
Well, I throw out, what are your thoughts? Yeah.
I think that we've taken some licks in the press, mm-hmm. But some of those were deserved. And we'll get better in some of those areas, and we could talk about those if you want. But I mentioned transparency and accountability, and I feel strongly about that. What I would say about the press coverage is that they've ignored some of the other things. And I'm not talking about building campuses, but the idea of what a unique university this is. If you go around this country, I don't think you'd find a university that, in terms of its size relative to the size and isolation of Hawaii, that's what makes this so important.
Right.
It does a lot of research, but at the same time, it does world-class research, and it reaches out to children who really do need an education.
Right.
We have a community college system that's fabulous. It gives people a second chance, or a third or fourth chance. We have Manoa, Hilo, and now West Oahu and Maui offering baccalaureates. And so it's really an important, and we're doing a lot, and these are important objectives, and some of those have been ignored in all of the Stevie Wonder, and how much is contributed. And I think sometimes it's worth reflecting on that, and I wish the press would do that sometimes.
Has there been any sense amongst students that perhaps some of the press coverage and brouhaha has been unfair? Any sense in terms of how UH is perceived, that it's hurtful, or is that not really a factor on students' minds?
I mean, I've heard some people are outraged, you know, especially, you know, in August and September, people were mad, and a lot of students were mad because, you know, we invest a lot of money into the university.
Sure.
But I think that that's kind of calmed down, and I think, like Regent Holzman said, you know, it's kind of a shame that that's the only press coverage is a scandal, because there is a lot of good stuff that happens. And, you know, I think that we're progressing, and especially at Manoa amongst graduate students, we're moving in the right direction. We're starting to move that way. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of good stuff that's still going on at the university.
Any thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, so I think especially at the UH Manoa campus, there's a ton of different initiatives and a lot of accomplishments that students have been achieving. You know, simply looking at the UH Manoa website, you get updates almost daily about something new that Manoa students are accomplishing, researchers are, you know, getting done. So I think a lot of that should be covered, but it hasn't necessarily been. You know, over the past year, for any elongated amount of time, the Stevie Wonder fiasco was covered immensely. You know, and I think, you know, that's like Tom said. I think it's said and done. It's time to move forward, and I think it's time to show what's really happening, and what kinds of things and the good that UH does output. With its
yeah,
students.
and I think there's some confusion between the system, University of Hawaii, and then each campus, because each campus has a lot of good things to offer, and even if they're messing up at the system, that doesn't affect what's going on campus. It's kind of a shame that they, there's this confusion between the two. But yeah, I think that what goes on campus is really positive, and maybe what happens at the system level isn't always as great.
Sure. All right, we've got a question from Malia in Makiki. Do panelists, especially the regent on the panel, feel that vision is an important quality in a UH president?
Absolutely. Vision is often part of leadership, and one of the things we really want is a leader, and a leader who can communicate a vision, both to the University Ohana, but as well to the people of Hawaii and the legislature and the governor. And so yes, we want a person with vision who sees beyond the horizon, and we want someone who's willing to lead in that direction.
Yeah, and I think common sense and realistic goals are important, and that goes along with vision, just setting realistic goals and having that vision of this is what we can accomplish and this is how we're going to accomplish it. That's important.
Your thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, especially with upper level executive management, a lot of times we focus on the accountability, the transparency, ensuring that things are managing well, which is a huge factor. But that when we put that at the forefront, sometimes we forget why we're doing things. So the vision is definitely important, and again, it's important if they can have a specific vision for the campus. If chosen as the next UH president, to really know what they want to accomplish, know what they're there to do, so.
Finding that.
Yeah.
In terms of vision, what sort of motivation is that for sort of the professional assembly, the people involved at the university? I mean, when you talk about vision, are you wanting to see someone who will get into sort of the nuts and bolts? We've just had a question whether the next president will be requiring off-campus housing that's costing extra, whether they'll protect against tuition increases and accreditation. Nuts and bolts, how important are those sort of things going to be? Any thoughts?
The state is cutting its funding for the university. The model after World War II was we fund and the kids come home from the war and they go to school and they don't have to pay really anything. We've decided that that's not the way to go, and so we've been cutting and cutting. As a result, tuition just inversely is related to that. It goes up when support goes down. In a wider sense, you've got to have an idea of sacrifice, that not everybody's going to get everything they want from a university. You're going to have to pay more, but you're going to get more, or I'm going to lose now, but I know this is going to make someone else stronger. And so if everybody just wants what they can get from the university, it's just going to be the warring states, what I can get before the other guy gets it.
Yeah.
And so in terms of vision, it's someone saying, this is, I call it the alma mater thing. That there's an alma mater, it's sort of, when I hear the song, I get sort of weepy-eyed, but this place is really good.
Right.
And so I want it to be as good as possible.
Yeah.
So I'm writing a check.
Yeah.
Or, I'm
Right.
paying more tuition because I really want to go there.
The pride and solidarity. This caller said, how about someone like Michelle Rhee, former chancellor of Washington, D.C. schools, from Michael in Kahului, which maybe leads to a question of mine, if not that person specifically. Does anyone have some people in mind that they'd really like the committee to take a look at?
I think of my fantasy is General Shinseki, because he's a Kauai boy. He's been away for a long time.
Interesting.
He's earned his scars, and if he talks, I think people are going to listen.
Interesting.
This is a genuine person who's not here just for a career. I don't know if we can get him back, but if they keep beating up on him in Washington, Hawaii may look pretty good. Someone like that.
Yeah, you heard it here first. I like it. Any other thoughts?
I'm nominating him.
Are you looking at me?
Well, everyone. You probably can't be very specific, I would imagine. But do you have any thoughts? Yeah.
I'm the searcher.
Yeah, I know. So I guess you. Well, how about you, Richard?
Again, at least for the interim, I think it'd be good to look in-house, just because of the temporary time they would serve. I don't have any specific names in mind, but I would imagine it would be someone who has faculty experience, administrative experience, and who has worked, if not on one campus, multiple campuses, so that they can get a feel of how to run a whole system. So that's just my thoughts.
May I ask a question here?
Yeah.
So David suggested General Shinseki. Richard, you just said you wanted someone with faculty experience. So how about a non-traditional candidate like General Shinseki, who probably doesn't have faculty experience?
I think for me, that aspect of being a faculty or working with students is key to run a university, but they're not the only type of people who can. So, having someone from the outside would probably be definitely a new change, just because of the trend. We've been hiring people who have been at universities, who have had university experience here or in the mainland. But I think that's something definitely we could look into.
If the candidate were extraordinary enough to trump a traditional criteria, then the students
and that kind of goes along with their leadership too.
And I want to warn everyone, we're in our final moments, and I definitely want to hear everyone's points. So if anyone has anything to say, if you could go ahead and throw it into the circle now. Any thoughts on that?
Don't look at me. I want to reiterate that I think we just, MRC Greenwood was really good. She came in, had to learn the system on the fly. There are a lot of people who expected her to do what they wanted rather than what the university needs. It's a tough job, and we want to rethink, we want to think again about whether this is the best setup. Is there another one? Can we, if you're going to have a president, what sort of support do they need? What are the things that they should not be involved in because it just diverts? Athletics was little Vietnam.
We learned that, right?
Yeah. So, give the chancellors independence. But let's think about what we want and try to get some sort of a statewide consensus. And I would hope the regents would be the ones who would lead that. In the meantime, have someone who can hold the fort and maybe heal some of the rough edges, and then move the university forward.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, Tom?
Along those same lines, just redefining the system level, trying to get rid of some of the overlap that occurs there, and really making specific designation of this is system level, this is campus level for everything, and really defining those roles, because I mean there was confusion, and I think the whole thing just needs to go through, you know, and say this is what this people do, this is what these people do, and
clear definitions.
Yeah, and set it up that way, and I think that could set up for success too.
And hopefully that lesson has been learned. In terms of going forward now, we're going to be hearing of an interim very soon. Possibly, right? Within, yes. And and will there be sort of a set period that they'll be in, and then the goal for the next person will immediately?
Well, there won't be a set period, but there will be a time until we find someone, and we will find someone. And it's a big responsibility, and we want this process to be as inclusive as we possibly can. We're glad this program is here so people will get interested and let us know what they're thinking, because we have a lot we need to hear.
All right.
And they need to speak.
Well,
yeah, and show up to the meetings.
Well said. All right. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed getting to talk to all of you. And thank you for coming tonight. On the next Insights, we'll examine the development of Honolulu's urban core, Governor Abercrombie's proposed third city for Oahu. What is being designed to transform Kaka'ako into a live, work, play neighborhood of cafes, parks, businesses, and a mix of upscale and affordable housing? What is the master plan, and will it support a positive population increase or further encourage urban plight? That's next time on Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Malia Mattoch. A hui hou.